What riches will God accept on Judgment Day? This video will reveal how we can live in a way that our actions and resources are pleasing to God, and how we can avoid the dangers of greed. If you want to understand better how to prepare for Judgment Day and live according to the values of God's kingdom, this video is for you. In Luke 12:13, Jesus teaches us about the dangers of relying on material wealth and the importance of being rich toward God. Get ready to be challenged and encouraged to live a prosperous life in all aspects, including the material. What riches are we accumulating for Judgment Day? This story told by Jesus illustrates the dangers of accumulating wealth without considering God's will. The story begins with an apparently trivial request. A man in the crowd asks Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus, perceiving the root of the problem, responds, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he takes the opportunity to teach a profound lesson about life and the values of God's kingdom. Jesus says, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." He then tells the parable of the rich fool. A rich man had an abundant harvest and thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." This is a moment of reflection for him. Instead of considering how he could use the abundance to benefit others or glorify God, he thinks only of himself. He decides to tear down his barns and build bigger ones, where he could store all his grain and goods. The rich fool says to his soul, "You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." He believes that his security and happiness are guaranteed because of his wealth. He feels self-sufficient and thinks he can live in comfort and pleasure for many years. However, he is mistaken. He is relying on his material possessions for his future without considering the fragility of life and God's sovereignty. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" God intervenes directly in the man's life, calling him a fool. The word fool here is used to describe someone who is spiritually blind and does not understand eternal realities. The man planned everything for his earthly future, but neglected his soul. He did not realize that his life could be taken at any moment and that he had no control over it. His wealth could not save his soul. Jesus then gives a warning. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. The focus is on the futility of accumulating material goods without a rich relationship with God. The rich man made plans for his material future, but neglected his spiritual preparation. He accumulated treasures on earth, but not in heaven. His life ended abruptly, and he was not prepared for eternity. And what practical lessons can we take into our Christian life to live in a way that pleases God? The parable shows us that trusting in material wealth is illusory. Earthly possessions do not offer true security. Only a relationship with God can give us the peace and security we seek. Life is uncertain, and riches can disappear or be taken from us in an instant. We must trust in God, who is the source of all true security. The rich man was not prepared to meet God. We must live each day with the awareness that our life is brief and that we must always be ready for eternity. The parable challenges us to consider our priorities and live in a way that honors God. In other words, Jesus calls us to be rich toward God, investing in our relationship with Him and using our resources for the good of others. We must seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. True wealth is in knowing and serving God. Our trust must be in Him and not in money. When we are rich toward God, we are storing up treasures in heaven that have eternal value. The parable challenges us to use our wealth and resources to help others and to promote God's kingdom. We must be generous and compassionate, sharing what we have with those in need. Generosity is a reflection of God's love in us and a practical way to demonstrate our faith. We should ask ourselves, how can I use my possessions to bless others and honor God? Therefore, the parable of the rich fool challenges us to reassess our priorities. Are we living to accumulate material goods, or are we seeking to be rich toward God? We must examine our hearts and ask, where is our treasure? How are we using our resources for God's glory? We must live with the purpose of glorifying God and serving others. This means being generous with our resources and willing to share what we have. Life is short, and we must take every opportunity to do good and show God's love. The parable reminds us of the importance of being prepared for eternity. We must live each day as if it were our last, keeping our hearts and minds focused on God. True preparation for eternity involves an intimate relationship with God and a life of obedience and service to Him. To understand this great message of Jesus, we need to understand the biblical context and the moment of the narrative. The parable of the rich fool is located in the middle of Jesus' ministry as he traveled to Jerusalem, where he would be crucified and resurrected. This period of Jesus' ministry is marked by many teachings about the kingdom of God and how to live according to its values. Jesus takes every opportunity to instruct his followers on what really matters in life and eternity. The parable is told in response to a request from a man in the crowd who wanted Jesus to intervene in an inheritance dispute. Instead of resolving the dispute, Jesus uses the opportunity to teach a deeper lesson about greed and priorities. Jesus responds with a warning about greed and the importance of not placing our trust in wealth. He uses this parable to illustrate the foolishness of relying on material goods instead of trusting in God. This is a moment of profound teaching where Jesus challenges his listeners to reconsider their priorities and live for God's kingdom. The great message of Jesus is that we should use our resources to glorify God and serve others instead of accumulating for ourselves. Jesus calls us to shift our focus from earthly things to heavenly treasures. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, but in a deep and meaningful relationship with God. True wealth is found in living according to the values of God's kingdom and investing in what has eternal value. Jesus also warns us about the dangers of greed, which is the root of many evils. It blinds us to the needs of others and traps us in an endless cycle of seeking more. We must be attentive to the signs of greed in our lives and seek contentment in God, knowing that He is the provider of all our needs. Greed makes us believe that we always need more to be happy, but true satisfaction comes from a generous and grateful heart. Now let's learn 5 ways to follow this message of Jesus in our spiritual journey. 1. Using our resources for God's glory. In what ways can we use our goods and resources to glorify God and serve others? How can we be generous and avoid greed? We must identify opportunities to use our resources for the good of others, whether through donations, helping those in need, or supporting missions and ministries. Generosity is a practical expression of our faith and a way to show God's love to the world. We must be willing to let go of our material goods and trust that God will provide all our needs. Practical examples include financially contributing to the church, supporting charity projects, offering our time and skills to serve in our community, and sharing our goods with those in need. 2. The importance of spiritual preparation. How can we spiritually prepare for Christ's return and live according to the values of God's kingdom? We must cultivate a life of prayer, Bible study, and fellowship with other believers. Practices such as fasting and communal worship help us keep our faith strong and prepare us for Christ's return. We must live each day with the expectation that Christ could return at any moment and always be ready, keeping our hearts and minds focused on things that have eternal value. Spiritual preparation involves a continuous commitment to growing in faith and holiness, seeking to live in a way that pleases God in all areas of our lives. 3. Demonstrating love and compassion. How can we demonstrate the love of Christ through practical acts of compassion and service? Who are the people around us that need our help and support? Demonstrating the love of Christ involves acts of service and compassion, such as feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and imprisoned, and welcoming strangers. We must be attentive to the needs of those around us, whether they are neighbors, co-workers, church members, or strangers we meet. Our compassion must be practical and tangible, reflecting God's love in every action. Ask yourself, who needs my support today? How can I be the hands and feet of Jesus to those who are suffering or in need? We must seek opportunities to serve and love others in concrete ways, demonstrating God's grace and mercy in our daily actions. 4. The grace and faithfulness of God. Through this parable, we see God's grace in calling us to participate in His kingdom and the faithfulness He expects from us in response. Our generosity and compassion are responses to the abundant grace we have received. God has given us much and expects us to respond with gratitude and faithfulness, living in a way that reflects His goodness and grace. God's grace enables us to live generously and invest our lives in things that have eternal value. 5. Judgment Day and the hope of the kingdom. This parable reminds us that there will be a final judgment where our actions will be evaluated. However, it also gives us hope, showing that those who are rich toward God will receive the eternal reward of being with Christ. Judgment Day will be a moment of separation and reward, where Jesus will evaluate our lives and works. But it will also be a moment of great hope, as those who have lived faithfully for Christ will be welcomed into His eternal kingdom. We must live with the hope and expectation that our faithfulness will be rewarded and that we are storing up treasures in heaven. In the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come," is a request for God's kingdom to fully manifest in our lives and in the world. The parable of the rich fool shows us how we should live as we await the complete realization of this kingdom. We must live with expectation and readiness, committed to doing God's will and preparing the way for His return. The Lord's Prayer reminds us to seek first God's kingdom and His righteousness, trusting that He will meet all our needs. The commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, Matthew 22:39, is exemplified in how we should use our resources. Our love for God should be reflected in concrete actions of love and service to others. Loving our neighbor is a practical expression of love for God and is central to the Christian life. We must seek ways to demonstrate this love daily, through our words and actions. Generosity and compassion are tangible ways to show Christ's love to others. In the theological study of this parable, there are two important aspects. 1. The faithfulness expected of us. The parable of the rich fool illustrates our responsibility to use our resources in a way that honors God. We are called to be good stewards and to use our possessions for the good of others and the advancement of God's kingdom. God expects us to live generously and compassionately, reflecting His grace in our lives. Faithfulness in managing our resources is an expression of our faith and obedience to God. 2. Final judgment. The certainty of final judgment calls us to a life of holiness, faithfulness, and compassion. We must be aware that our actions have eternal consequences. Final judgment will be a moment of accountability, where each of us will be evaluated for our works and faith. We must live with a clear conscience and a determination to follow God's will, knowing that we will be rewarded for our faithfulness and service. Final judgment motivates us to live in a way that honors God and to seek to store up treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy. If Jesus were standing before you and asked, "Have you been a good steward? Have you used what I entrusted to you to help people?" Tell us in the comments. What other parable would you like to see here? If this message touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and watch our next video, where we will learn more profound teachings from Jesus. If you want to bless this channel, click the thanks button and help us continue spreading God's message to other people who might also be touched. May God bless you and your faith journey.